It's 1972, and a group of soldiers are traveling in a Royal Australian Air Force helicopter. But as the soldiers fly over this remote part of Papua New Guinea, full of wetlands and jungle, they discover something truly incredible. Down there on the ground is a huge, partially hidden vehicle that has been missing for 3 decades. Have the soldiers solved a mystery that has fascinated people for 30 years? Well, it seems so. Soldiers flew over Papua New Guinea's jungle and discovered a huge hidden object in the grass. The location where the plane was discovered shows why it remained undetected for all these years. After all, Papua New Guinea has some of the most exotic wilderness areas in the world. The diverse ecosystems include lush tropical rainforests, rugged mountain ranges, volcanoes, savannas and swamps. The object the Australian soldiers discovered was in a particularly remote crocodile-infested swamp called a gamebo. This partly explains why the find was so incredibly well preserved. Simply put, it was in a very inaccessible place, one you wouldn't easily stumble past. The crocodiles don't make it any better either. But what was this mysterious object? Amazingly, it was a World War II bomber now known by the nickname Swamp Ghost. Over the years, the aircraft has been viewed as something of a holy grail of military aviation history. It was widely believed that it was impossible to recover this aircraft, aviation archaeologist Fred Hagen told Southern California Public Radio in 2010. This is where David Talashe Jr. comes into play. A Dallas-born entrepreneur and World War II veteran. In addition to building dozens of aviation-themed restaurants, Talashe also had a side business collecting and restoring military aircraft. In fact, at one point he owned more than 120 aircraft, including a B-25 Mitchell bomber and a P-40 Tomahawk. Coincidentally, during his military career, Talashe was co-pilot of the same 4-engine bomber type as the one discovered in Papua New Guinea. And so in the 1980s, Hagen and Talashe began a salvage operation that would take decades to complete. It was our biggest dream, Hagen told South California Public Radio. Because for some reason it captured the imagination of people from all over the world. The gigantic aircraft was in fact a B-17E Flying Fortress of the American Air Force. According to tradition, Boeing's name was chosen after comments made by a Seattle Times journalist on the day of an early test flight in July 1935. "Why, it's a flying fortress," he had reportedly explained. Despite having spent decades outdoors, Swamp Ghost was remarkably well preserved at the crash site. And when Talashe and Hagen finally dug it up, they became the proud owners of a piece of aviation history. In fact, it was one of only 4 B-17s in the world to be recovered. In fact, the Pacific Aviation Museum in Hawaii later described it as the world's only intact and unretired World War II-era B-17E bomber, a unique example of an aircraft that played an indispensable role in victory in World War II. And it is the only B-17 in the world that still bears its battle scars. The history of the B-17 dates back to the early 1930s. Roosevelt's effort to modernize the U.S. military included fielding a new generation of bombers that could carry significant payloads and deliver supplies to remote bases in Hawaii, Panama, and Alaska. As a result, the B-17 prototype was designed by Boeing for a competition in 1935. Over the years, the aircraft's design evolved to accommodate technical improvements. Finally, in September 1941, the first B-17s entered service. A total of 12,731 B-17 aircraft were in service by the end of the war, including 8,600 of the final B-17G model. Swamp Ghost was scheduled to fly from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor just 1 day before the Japanese attacked on December 7, 1941. But as fate would have it, the aircraft did not fly with Kangaroo Squadron that day. Instead, it flew on some of the earliest American bombing missions of World War II. Then disaster struck. On January 23, 1942, the Japanese invaded Rabaul, a community on the island of New Britain in Papua New Guinea, threatening Allied bases in the region. A month later, on February 23, Swamp Ghost was sent to bombard Japanese ships in Rabaul Harbor. However, things didn't go according to plan. The plane, piloted by Captain Frederick "Fred" C. Eaton Jr., encountered problems when the crew attempted to open the bomb bay doors. The doors stuck, and Eaton had to circle around the huge Japanese freighter that was their target. They managed to drop the bombs on the second pass, but by then they were coming under fire from Japanese fighters and air defenses. A battle ensued in which the flying fortress shot down 3 of a dozen enemy fighters. However, the port wing was then pierced by the fire. Luckily, the anti-aircraft gun didn't explode, but in the meantime the plane ran out of fuel and was forced to crash land. Unable to reach Papua New Guinea's capital of Port Moresby, Eaton approached the Owen Stanley Mountains, and what he thought was a large wheat field in the lowlands of Oro Province was actually 3-meter-tall marsh grass. Miraculously, the plane landed without the crew sustaining any major injuries. However, they were now stranded in the middle of nowhere. For days they wandered, hungry and exhausted, through the remote wilderness of Papua New Guinea, where they burned under the sun and were bitten by mosquitoes. Everyone eventually contracted malaria. Luckily, a helpful native eventually led them to the safety of his village. The crew was nursed back to health, and upon reunion with American forces, they were almost immediately sent on a new mission. Meanwhile, the crashed flying fortress was forgotten until the helicopter's flight in 1972. Hagen's recovery operation was finally completed in 2006. Additionally, 4 years later, permission was granted to allow Swamp Ghost to return to the United States. It was then exhibited for its first public viewing in Long Beach, California, and among the guests were family members of the original crew. Since 2013, the aircraft has been at the Pacific Aviation Museum in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The museum plans to restore the bomber and display it in a hangar on Ford Island, a small island in the harbor. And while the cost could exceed $5 million, that's a modest price to pay for preserving a national treasure. To this day, World War II relics continue to be discovered around the world. For example, when Imgur user Canada Speedoman and his wife were hiking through Greenland's hinterland, they came across a haunting reminder of that not-so-distant past. The couple had spent days wandering through the fjords, getting further and further away from anything resembling civilization. Then they came across piles of old barrels and the twisted frames of long-collapsed buildings. East Greenland is a remote and lonely part of the world. The landscape consists of mountains and lakes and is enclosed in pack ice almost all year round. But in this vast wilderness, hikers discovered the rusting remains of a structure, one that dates back to a time when the area played a very important strategic role. Amid the rocky peaks, the United States had built an airstrip on land near an Eskimo camp called Ikadik. It was intended to be a refueling station for military aircraft flying from America to Europe during World War II. The facility is still there and is slowly falling into disrepair. Work on the airstrip, known as Bluey East 2, began in 1942. A year earlier, America had taken over the defense of Greenland and was looking for sites where a 1.5 kilometers long airstrip could be built. Eventually they found the best location, 56 kilometers northeast of Tasiilaq. So on July 26, 1942, a supply of flotillas arrived and construction work began. The airfield was in operation from 1942 to 1947. However, after the end of the war in 1945, Bluey East 2's importance began to wane. In fact, like other American bases in Greenland, it was evacuated 2 years later. However, the location's inaccessibility is largely responsible for ensuring that their legacy remains visible to anyone lucky enough to find it. Everything the Americans used to build Bluey East 2 had to be shipped in. There are few, if any, trees in East Greenland, so the wood had to be driven over. But this also meant that at the time of departure, no one wanted to take everything away again. However, it wasn't just the buildings that remained. Almost everything was left to the elements. And now there are hundreds of barrels lying around the area. These containers were used to refuel the planes, and some of them still have fuel in them. All in all, stumbling upon it in the middle of nowhere is certainly strange. Today there are huge machines next to the barrels. These were used to build the airstrip which formed the heart of Bluey East 2. The runway was completed in 1943 and made of gravel. Today you can still see how it was cut into the cold earth. However, most of the useful things left behind at Bluey East 2 have been removed by the local Inuit over the last 70 years. However, anything that could not be taken on foot or in small fishing boats remains where it was left. Interestingly, old photos from the time when the facility was built also show that it wasn't just machines that were needed to create the runway. Huge boxes of explosives were also used. After all, East Greenland is not a place where building or maintaining large complexes is easy. At that time, the base was supplied by the American Coast Guard whenever possible. In winter, when snow could not be cleared from the runway, provisions were dropped from the air. After the Americans left, the Danish government had no interest in Bluey East 2. Although Americans no longer used Bluey East 2, it still provided occasional benefits. In 1958, the facility played an important role in supplying the construction of an early warning radar system further south in Kulisk. After the end of the war, however, the place never regained its former importance. Today, among the twisted metal are other interesting items left behind by the Americans. There are shards of glass on the ground marked with the telltale Coca-Cola logo, a clear reminder of the short-lived occupation of the airfield by the American Air Force. Meanwhile, other static machines remain in addition to the earth-moving machines. The boilers and ovens that once heated and powered the base are mostly still intact. One of them even bears the logo of the New York company that built it. However, the buildings around it have long since collapsed. Other equipment can also be seen. A fallen radio mast, its frame pointing towards a body of water with icebergs eerily drifting past. And the radios themselves are still there, but they're mostly just dilapidated metal boxes sitting in the middle of a cold environment. It's not just metal that's left. Thick black tires sit between the rubble. Some of them are still wrapped in snow chains that help them during the coldest days of the year. The tires are marked United States Rubber Company. So the site has been abandoned for more than half a century, and yet there's a chance it won't last much longer. The redevelopment of Bluey East 2 has been a political point of contention between the governments of Greenland and Denmark for some time. But it seems that the two governments have finally reached an agreement. In 2017, the two governments concluded that it was time to clean up all the trash remaining on the abandoned runway. Efforts will therefore soon be made to rid the area of this strange, rusty relic of the Second World War. The cleanup was scheduled to begin in 2018. If this is the case, Canada Speedoman and his wife may be the last people who were able to visually document the runway's remains. Once the major cleanup is complete, it is entirely possible that there will be nothing left of the American base at all. The wilderness of East Greenland will be virtually empty again. Of course, that makes these photos even more important. Bluey East 2 played a role in one of the greatest conflicts in human history. And although it has become a rotting ruin, it is still a fascinating, bizarre place, and one made even stranger by its incredible surroundings. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.